Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome to this fifth event of Designing for Public Life. I'm Ben Gilmartin. I'm a partner of Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro Architects, and for just a few more months, I have the honor to be your 2025 AIA chapter president. I want to quickly say thanks to our President Circle. I wanted to briefly make note that we are, somehow we got the wrong label in here. Sorry, guys. We're on Kate Orff, not Mabel Wilson, but we have one more dialogue on November 19th with Mary Miss that my partner in crime, Anne-Marie Baranowski, will be the interlocutor with, so I hope you'll come back for that. I want to put a plug in for Searching for Superpublics, which is the exhibition upstairs that was a part of my presidential year, and will in some part be a little bit of a springboard for what we're talking about tonight, or at least we'll make reference to it a little bit in the conversation, hopefully. And then on to the introduction. I'll say briefly that Designing for Public Life is organized with the support of AIA New York Cultural Facilities, Global Dialogues, and the Planning and Urban Design Committees. It's a series of conversations examining the forces reshaping both our contemporary public life and the physical spaces that we're designing to support it. I'd say that now more than ever, there is a greater desire for vital public space across the 5 boroughs. Our shared public life intersects with and reveals our most urgent and collective challenges. So we talk about Hurricane Sandy, climate crisis, environmental justice. We can think about George Floyd and structural racism, social justice and inequity, the pandemic, and the intersection of our public realm with health, well-being, and social connection. Homelessness is visible in our public realm, the housing crisis, and quite alarmingly now ICE and immigration, the occupation of our cities, and the urgent need for collective democratic action. Oh, I'm sorry. You guys have the wrong intro. Thank you for Anne-Marie for pointing out. I sent in an intro today, but this isn't it. So anyway, that's not our topic for today. Our topic is new urban ecologies. How is the creation of our public spaces evolving now and who are its superheroes? Tonight we're searching for optimism, and we're talking about the shared spaces of the city, their human, non-human, and resource infrastructures as an urban ecology. And I'm very excited to have Kate Orff presenting and speaking, and we'll do a conversation together and with you all. Briefly about Kate, Kate focuses on retooling the practice of landscape architecture relative to the uncertainty of climate change and creating spaces that foster social life, which is explored through publications, activism, research, and projects. Widely recognized as a leading voice in landscape architecture, urban design, and climate adaptation. In the global context, she is known for advancing complex, creative, and collaborative work that advances the broad environmental and social prerogatives. Kate was the first landscape architect to receive the MacArthur Foundation's prestigious Genius Grant in 2017. She's a director of urban design, the Urban Design Program, co-director of the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes, and professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She also sits on the Commission on Accelerating Climate Action for the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is well known, as well as the advisory board for the Ocean Lab, a policy think tank. So momentarily, I'll invite Kate up to share opening thoughts, and then she and I will start off with a conversation together, in part using the exhibition upstairs, Searching for Superpublics, on which she was an advisor during the early gestation of ideas part, as a springboard for our conversation. Most importantly, we'll leave a good amount of time for you to ask questions and have a broader dialogue And finally, as a coda, Kate and her Practicescapes book, Towards an Urban Ecology, is now out in a reprinting, and at the end, there'll be an opportunity to acquire a copy, which she will sign for you if you ask her, I believe. So I'd like to welcome Kate up now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. I have prepared some remarks to kind of set the stage for the conversation and for some Q&A. We're all kind of like friends or 2 or 3 degrees of separation here, so no like lecturing from the mountaintop here. We want to just kind of get into a conversation. I really took, Ben, and congratulations on your presidency. I'm so proud of what you've done so far. I really took the assignment kind of literally. Like, all right, let's search. Let's do the searching. Let's talk about what a superpublic is, what is the public, and what we need to do now. I'm the founder of Scape, and I think what I try to just promulgate is this like idea of landscape thinking at all scales, how to think systematically, how to think about ecosystems, and how to think about publics, and how do these things weave together. So I really think about Scape's work of not just like building landscapes. We do that. I deal with contractors all the time. But what I think is I want to put forward today is that we are making superpublics through the reciprocity of the landscapes that we are building, and then the constituencies and people that are coming together around those landscapes. So there's not a physical landscape in my world that is separate from a kind of a public that is defined, fostered, and sort of accelerated through the physical work. So I wanted to just sort of throw some fun things out there. I mean, I've written several books. I do not have a PhD, so everyone can just poke holes in what I'm about to say. But so let's just kind of break it down a little bit. I'm thinking specifically about New York, right? What are the eras of public space that we've had in New York? If we say, yes, the Lenape and the sort of, profound, attention to indigenous history. But, and when we've been in a city building era, what have they been? First, big new municipal parks, right? Then an era of modernity with Frederick Law Olmsted. And then finally, what I'm calling tiny gestures. So I guess I'm kind of putting forward that right now we're in tiny gestures. But this is really these big parks, right? That first, topic on the list was just this incredible moment in, of course, landscape history and urban history, right? You think about Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux Central Park, right? This kind of iconic singular green mat kind of floating in pre-developed Manhattan. We think about Prospect Park. We think about, Morningside and all the ways that these large singular parks have helped shape the city, and the cities have grown around them, right? This was a major moment where, around post-Civil War, we were literally trying to find ways to repair our fabrics, to try to bring people together, to try to invent a public. And there's some great social histories of Central Park that show how women and African Americans and everyone is kind of invited into this park over a long series of very, very, very contentious debates. But this superpublic, this park helped create New York, right? And in turn, New York created the park. It's this kind of something that is actively participating. And then next, this era of modernity, right? After we have our kind of, Victorian, for lack of a better word, city, our old city, our kind of colonial Dutch English empire, then all of a sudden, Robert Moses came on the scene, and I'm simplifying wildly here, so everybody knows that, but came on the scene, right? And it was like, we're going to build highways. We're going out to Nassau. We're blowing through farmland. We're going to cut the Bronx in half. We're going to, make Queens look like, Swiss cheese. And then these landscapes by Moses were also quite massive in their ambition, right? They had a very, very different intent. They were serving a very different public, and they were basically, like Haussmann in Paris, like ripping open the fabric of New York and the physical landscapes of New York to try to create these massive modern connections. And here you can see close to where I live, Forest Park, which was a big, large, contiguous park, now getting eaten away by all these little things in the down. And then this is what Robert Moses put through Forest Park, right, which is the Jackie Robinson and what exists today. So, there's superpublics are fabricated. Superpublics are a result of very, very many, decisions, large and small, intentional and unintentional. And so even though if you might look at a map of New York today, and if you were to look like a green map, you would see all these patches of green. But then look at this. This is a landscape by Moses. What does that mean? This is actually as is said, it's like division by design, right? This is one of the wealthier neighborhoods, Forest Hills Gardens. This is a very, poorer neighborhood, sort of parts of East and Central Brooklyn. They were once connected by a park. And now Jackie Robinson, as you can see in this, is just a series of walls. So we're making superpublics and we're cutting them open all the time, intentionally and not. And then finally, again, wild oversimplification. So let's get into this in the Q&A. But I'm calling this tiny gestures of livability. And this is not in any way to underrepresent the massive importance of William H. White and Holly White, the privately owned public spaces and so on. But really, just think about this era. We had this big era of building towers, really building out the physical, kind of built infrastructure and the city. And then Holly White was one of the first people to really kind of say, like, how are people actually using these spaces? And let's learn from that. But that kind of set into motion, a big era of like, and I've worked on thousands of them, it seems like at this point, like tiny little public spaces with like benches facing each other and so on and so forth. But, so my question to you all is like, let's keep searching because this feels insufficient, right? So what I kind of wanted to put forward as a sort of a launching into a discussion is this kind of idea of superpublics and the next era of superpublics around this idea of urban ecology. And I have this book, which is reprinted, so I'm so happy to have it. And the idea of urban ecology, really thinking about if you were to take the city and like a sock and pull it inside out and you see the water and you see the landscapes, kind of that to me is this next era of public space. These are the ecosystems that we need to kind of think about as a template for the new era of public space. And so in this particular book, I was kind of looking at these terms: revive, engage, cohabit, scale, which is almost like a battle cry for what does landscape need to do now? And this was, again, 10 years ago. But the book itself kind of, travels through and describes these terms as like, okay, here's the new vocabulary for the new superpublic and the why. But I think we need new words, even better words now. And so if I were to write a new book, what would these words be? What should they be? Let's workshop it. Because I do feel like now that we have this incredibly, this city fabric, the fabric that we have made, what are the operations that we need to do to kind of unmake some of those problems, right? Like the Robert Moses, Jackie Robinson problem that I showed before. And what do we need to do to kind of put forward a whole new kind of idea about what public space can do? And in my mind, in terms of landscape, it can do a lot. Obviously, we can clean our water, we can clean our air, we can connect upland to our lowland, we can kind of develop this new guts, landscape infrastructure guts for the city. But to do that, we have to depave. We have to remove things. It's not just about all of us being great architects and like sketching something on a napkin. It's really about like, what do we need to remove? We need to remove actually a lot to make a contiguous landscape fabric. What do we need to retrofit? Because we have a city that we have already made, and therefore we have to retrofit it, but retrofit it with a big vision in mind. We have separated things. We have separated districts, neighborhood, redlinings. So we have to stitch things. And that idea of the stitch is very important, linking things that have been severed. And then finally, follow the water. We have to follow the water because that is the next era of climate change, sea level rise, of rain bombs, and everything else. So I put this forward. This is a drawing that we did in 2013 after Mayor Bloomberg. We were on this kind of special commission to kind of look at Superstorm Sandy. But you can see here that the water and it kind of forms the template for this next era of what I would call city making or city building. And then, with these big kind of, the new park is Jamaica Bay. And the new kind of public spaces are in the water. They're reefs, they're wetlands, they're islands. And so, even though this was a plan that was really developed, post Superstorm Sandy, it's really putting forward the water as this kind of like next era of publicness and of stewardship. So yeah, and that is including, as per my chapter on cohabit, that is including other living things, not just people. It's also including shellfish, finfish, and understanding the entire Hudson estuary as a living organism and as our new public realm. So this is this drawing. Hopefully some of you recognize this drawing from 2009. It's an oldie, but goodie. It was 16 feet long at the time, but it was a vision. It was this exact vision of an urban ecology linking upland, and this is a kind of a cross-section of the time the Gowanus, and then out in our water bodies, this was an idea about a living reef. And the idea was to kind of connect these water and land through these cycles of regeneration that were inspired by the oyster, and that can help kind of put forward a new idea about how people and nature can live together. So that was a fun, kind of thing. Actually, Mary Miss, who's speaking here next week, came to this pinup where I'm standing. She was in the door, and I was like, I think that's Mary Miss. So I was super excited to see her there, totally a fangirl. And so this was this idea that we put forward. But now, this was called oyster texture. It lived in the white walls of the museum. But guess what? We've built this and we've built that at this point. This is the OG of the Torridon urban ecology regarding, the upland idea around the Gowanus, and then now this reef, which has taken the form of living breakwaters. So I'm super excited about it. So I'm going to blow through these slides, but these are really just how the idea was conceived about, learning from other species, building an idea from the life cycle of the oyster, thinking about how people and nature can coexist and really kind of build this bond. And that part of the joy in the climate change world, am I allowed to say that, is exactly like these moments when we get to not think about like we're passive occupants of a landscape that's picturesque and distant, but we actually get to be in that landscape and play in that landscape and work in that landscape. And so I'm just going to go through these two components of the OG now, which is the original gangster, which is the reef and the Gowanus itself. So the Gowanus project, so I'm going to start in the inland part, is a big, example of these first two terms, depave and retrofit. Most of you know this site, right? We've all been to the Gowanus, and you can see, some patches of green in the neighborhoods, and then you can see this kind of fabric, industrial fabric in transition along it. But as we all know, of course, this was an estuary. This was a wild living marsh that had one of the oysters as big as dinner plates. You can see red hook, and then really, this is really where the water wanted to go and where it used to be. And of course, we've straightened that canal for barge traffic to make turning basins and so on and so forth. Also to support our industrial economy, which of course we've all benefited from. So this is what that landscape looked like a couple of years ago, and here we go. It's a 14-foot tall vertical bulkhead wall that does not support any living thing. Saddest moment of my recent life was seeing a horseshoe crab like trying to get up on this, and it basically is and on the opposite side you can see the old level of the city, right, like around 6 or 7, and this is up at 14 or 15. So this is the landscape in transition that helped spark the Gowanus Lowlands Plan, and this is something we did with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and this is really their kind of initiative that they're pushing forward. But this is an example of this, what I would call a retrofit, a visionary retrofit of a district which had no public space, right? Because all these private properties going immediately up to the edge of the bulkhead wall. And so we had to retrofit it for both a public space vision and for habitat and for basically a coherent public realm. We were searching for a Superpublic in a way when we did this project. And so of course we took all of our cues from the former lowlands fabric, And then obviously the urban watershed, which is of course our sewage, and combined them. And then worked across this very vast scale, which is a scale which is made up of many, many private parcels, right? There's no more Olmsted making a square or those were in most cases, land that was only partly occupied. In this way, this is like designed to the gild. So we had to come up with strategies that many, many developers could use and to develop this public realm incrementally and retrofit one. So we had to develop all kinds of tools like the bulkhead decision-making matrix to introduce to developers to say like, look, you don't have to do that vertical bulkhead wall. You can actually step the wall down. You can make intertidal habitat, and that helped inform the city's planning. But I'm going to fast forward here. So we've ended up doing multiple projects along the Gowanus that have, developed from the lowlands. So incrementally, this lowlands project has taken shape over 8, 9, 10 parcels at this point. So there's a design vocabulary. It is kind of advancing this public realm. It's pushing back buildings, advancing this kind of big, thick right-of-way, introducing stepped landscapes to kind of bring you down closer to the water, cutting down the bulkhead where we can, envisioning street creeks, reintroducing these lost waterways, filtering the water, creating tidal shelves, so we have intertidal habitat, and generally kind of renaturing the edge as much as we are allowed to, right? Because these are also parks and spaces that are defined by city policy, but which we helped shape. And then just really connecting upland to the water bodies, as you can see here in this kind of street creek. So another story which helped spark that, the OG coming to be, which was sadly Superstorm Sandy, which was, I think probably everybody remembers, if you lived in New York, where you were during this epic hurricane. And Superstorm Sandy really kind of taught us so much here in the region. I'm sure many of you have worked on projects in different scales, housing, infrastructure, et cetera, that are in the wake of Sandy. But where we did besides the big urban plan, we worked in Staten Island, which is here, where you can see the wave action was so intense that literally you had boats going into housing. So that reef, that community-built reef in the Gowanus, basically morphed through a lot of study, a lot of analysis, and a lot of collaboration into this project called Living Breakwaters. And when I say searching for Superpublics, this is what I mean. And that is that this is a 2-mile long chain of breakwaters that slows the water, cleans the water, but it also is much more than that. It is a piece of physical infrastructure, but it has engendered a new kind of world, a new superpublic that is inclusive of finfish, shellfish, oysters, and teachers, fishermen, everybody else who has kind of joined the coalition around the project, right? So it is in and of itself an idea that a physical landscape can engender a public and vice versa. So I'm going to kind of just show a few more images of this, but I think my major point is made here that, of course, we can be informed by our former landscape footprint. Everything in dark teal here was a giant reef, and if you can see, that is Staten Island. With our project is located here, where there were 2 massive reefs known as the Great Reefs. We developed this physical breakwater, obviously, to maximize its efficacy as climate infrastructure, to reduce wave action, to protect the shore, to reduce erosion on the beach. And then we engineered it to maximize its intertidal habitat benefit. We had to work with our elected officials, Republican and Democrat, to fund the project. And I always say this is Chuck Schumer, who was like living breakwaters. And he has his Brooklyn accent and helped advocate for us to get the breakwaters funded. But God bless him, he was out there in front of the cameras, and it happened. We learned to describe this not just as a public project, but as infrastructure for its ability to, stop and halt erosion, to reverse erosion, to replenish the beach, to rebuild ecosystems. We tested it in physical model, in digital model. We designed the entire project as a pilot because we wanted to test the efficacy of these different treatments and ecological treatments. But of course, it's a physical project, but it is a way of bringing people together around an idea and has kind of in itself created its own new public, right? So these are ongoing, even before the project was built, this community was sort of galvanized and working together in a unique way. And these are our scapers and community members and Billion Oyster Project folks, installing this reef, and also kind of we have a whole series of oyster gardens and getting larvae in the water so that when the physical structure is built, we have larvae in the water and places for the spat to settle. We made this even more dense by developing a curriculum with the Billion Oyster Project. So, anybody can freely download this, and like teachers can integrate it into their, hands-on project-based repair and learning and restoration learning into their curriculum. So the whole point is like, I don't think about a project as like the ribbon cutting and then it's done. It kind of starts from the first day, and the public and the project then kind of are moving together and merging. And by the end of the ribbon cutting, you have oysters, and then you also have people and this new, and you also have seals. Sorry. You also have seals. This is Stanley, the seal, who showed up for his photo shoot right on time and on cue. But the point is that this is now ongoing, right? This is now oyster gardening, and this is an image from last month where the oysters themselves were being placed on the structure to try to accelerate oyster growth. And it exists. Of course, it exists as a piece of beautiful physical infrastructure. It's on the map. You can see it from the airplanes, and it is performing its function as climate infrastructure. But below the water, it's also, creating a public of a new revitalized kind of ecological public, if you will, reintroducing that subtidal and intertidal habitat that's gone down to below 1% of its its former extents. And so a couple notes, and I'm going to switch to these two words, depave and stitch, and I'm going to close here so we can get on to the conversation. But these are two biggies, right? So what do you do when you have a city? And if you just look at Long Island, it's the amount of just the way that we've just sealed off the ground from the sky it's very short-sighted and problematic. So the idea of depaving and stitching, and I'm going to go back to Queens because I'm a Queens resident, so I'm going to talk about Queens a lot, is a work that we've just recently completed here for Flushing Meadows. There's a hint as to what this park should be about in its name. It's called Flushing Meadows, and it's also called Corona Park. So just think about all the contradictions embedded with the series of these four words, right? There's a meadow, it's supposed to be Flushing. There's a Corona. it's like Corona Park, and that kind of speaks to the Robert Moses era, right? When we had the World's Fair here. It is so many contradictions piled up in this one piece of land. And, over time, you've all been here. Over time, it used to be this meadow and this kind of interconnected series of water bodies that, brought, that the tide came in, the tide came out. We filled it up with our ash from our, energy incinerators. It was the Valley of Ashes, right? Literally like the smoldering landscape of the Great Gatsby. Robert Moses came in and did his number on it, and I'm glad to highlight that, right? So there we have our, what that is. Anyway, it was an era, right? But all the things I'm talking about are manifest here in this one piece of ground. And then you have disconnected, basically lakes that are dysfunctional, really, as any kind of flushing action. You have tidal gate here that's overwhelmed. And then, we have, really at the beginning of this project, it was like, this park is flooding, help, right? All of you architects who someone came into your office and was like, we need this. And you're like, actually, wrong question. But the reality is, it's supposed to flood, right? It's supposed to retain water. It is a former marshland, wetlands, right? All of Queens, not all of Queens, but this whole portion of Queens is pushing water into this landscape. And then we put all this stuff there, parking lots, stadium, someone's trying to put a casino here. We've got, so, and then it's like, oh, my parking lot is flooding. So, this is what I mean about depave, right? Because it's like, okay, we're not going through all these backflips and gymnastics to try to protect the parking lot from flooding, right? So, but this was just an incredibly instructive project, because what we were able to kind of begin to try to talk about is how could we do both of these things? How could we kind of, actually all four of these things, how could we depave it? How could we retrofit it? How can we stitch these pathways together? And how can we follow the water? If any one of you has ever walked in a contiguous fashion from here to here, God bless you. You would be swimming. You would be under a 4-foot, highway underpass. You would be knee deep in mud. You would be, slashing and burning your way through Phragmites. This park, we think we're doing good because we got the green on the map. It is so wildly discontiguous. It is, the pathways don't go anywhere. And then we're also like, oh gosh, where does the water go? So my whole thing on this project has been like, we need to redesign this park so that the park functions can exist, but we need safe places for the water to go. So this can kind of coexist, right? So that we can still have our, parking lots and our. So we began to kind of think about reconnecting the water system, and then in particular, daylighting the creek that is currently in a big culvert in certain areas. So I'm really excited about this, and I know it's not, dare I say, I hope it's not an original idea. I think it's been around since the beginning of time, right? So, but we're really trying to do it now. So we developed with DPR and with the Waterfront Alliance this strategy for kind of trying to advance daylighting Flushing Creek, right? But with that, we can also make a stitch. We can make contiguous pathways. We can connect the water. And then we can, sort of look at some of these historic assets in a new light. And then through cut and fill, make these safe places for the water to go. So I'm pretty excited about this just because, this is kind of what we need to be doing everywhere. This is just a proxy for this disconnection between our bays and our inlands, and how we're not putting 14-foot bulkhead walls everywhere, guys. So let's figure out how we can have places for the water to go, and then retrofit and think about our parks and the publics that we can create, right? And then now, all of a sudden, all of these, through this project too, all of these connections that, you can't even move from here to here to here to here. You can't ride a bike, then maybe we make a new kind of Superpublic for Queens, right? That is actually connecting the length of this park that looks all green and nice, but is actually just a series of very, very disconnected and frankly dangerous moments. So, I'm going to end with these two slides, or a couple of slides, which is like, all right, we can do better. Right, so this is an example of the Phragmites, an invasive reed, coming in because the water regime was so radically changed. This is an example of a path, which is now, flooded, next to a parking lot. So we can do better. We have to do better. We have to think bigger. This is a photograph that I took. This is a golf course, right? But actually, so this is part of this entire area up here, right? So everything that I'm photographing is actually already happening. So let's just start there in terms of our visions for the future. Start with what's happening, because everything on this side of the line is supposed to be a green park, and this was Ophelia. And so I'm going to close with this image just because I think it kind of wraps a lot of these remarks up into one little package. What do we see in this image? A fake Olmstedian lamppost, right? We see trees which cannot handle this amount of water. We see all the valley of ashes before us. We see people that are really trying to have some kind of a party over here. And then some people walking along. So, without more landscape driven thinking, this is our future, right? This kind of retro, nostalgia for the past, along with an inability to accept the future. So when we're searching, I hope that we can keep these 4 new terms in mind, and I hope I've given you some things to think about in terms of this Superpublics theme. Thanks.
That was inspiring.
Great.
I'll ask a couple questions, and then we can probably open it up to the audience.
Sure.
I guess a kind of broad one. I would say that, you mentioned Moses in the 20th century, the kind of scientific or engineered views of infrastructure, city making, public spaces were public spaces, parks were parks, storm sewer systems were storm sewer systems. And it felt like that carried through my undergraduate education at the end of the later 20th century. It does feel like, in relation to the title of your book and its subject towards an urban ecology, that the thinking amongst designers and public agency officials and things like that has become about a layered approach to thinking about urbanism, where those different dimensions of engineering and designing cities has become more synthetic and more connected and more interwoven. So I guess I was going to say, just as the highest level question, you've been a proponent almost from the beginning of that thinking, or certainly when it came into a more mainstream place. Do you feel like we've arrived at a paradigm shift, or we're still evolving? Have we arrived at a thinking that's about cities as and public places and things like that as ecologies, as urban ecologies, or do you think it's still an evolving thing that needs to be advocated for?
I definitely feel like it still needs to be advocated for. And I think part of, I showed Living Breakwaters and I was like, here's 7 seconds on something that took 10 years. But I think like an example just of that is that, of course, we participated in this HUD Rebuild by Design competition, and we got like $63 million for the state of New York to build this infrastructure. And then immediately it was like, oh, well, that's just for the physical project. That doesn't include, the oyster restoration. That doesn't include any of the sort of social life pieces. So, we know how to do physical infrastructure, and sometimes poorly. But immediately it was just sort of like, oh, we're not going to be doing that other stuff. And I had to be like, no, that is the project. That's also the project. So we pulled $3 million for, oyster cultivation. And we did that, but and we had to separate all the permits out. And so the whole thing that looks wildly coherent here was only cohered by crazy, gritty people who were like, we're not letting this go. But I think in general, we're not necessarily set up to do those things simultaneously. We're set up to do, like, as anyone in this audience could say, we're doing like, capital project and M&O, and like maintenance. But my point is like, both of those things are landscape, and it's not like you can push something to the future. So I do feel like it's very difficult to advance all these things forward at the same time. The Gowanus is a great example too, because the Gowanus Canal Conservancy is a nonprofit that's kind of set up. So when we developed the Lowlands Plan, from the get-go, the Conservancy was there to sort of say, Central Park Conservancy exists around Central Park, but this agency or this group of nonprofit actually is ready to receive these public spaces. So I think that's another interesting example of the urban ecology working, because it wasn't just like throwing out a project into the world. It was that there was this entire network of people that were already mobilized to pull it forward. So I think that would be something to change. And then obviously everybody here is working on projects in New York. I mean, I kind of implied this in the talk, but we are kind of like nibbling around the edges a little bit. So when you think about the enormity of what was done in the past, just because our city is largely built out, it doesn't mean we can't still have big ideas, right? And we still have to have those ideas and work towards them. In my mind, I don't know, maybe other opinions here.
So, I mean, you spoke a lot. Follow the water, and I think beginning to you did incredible projects, which I think are exemplars for how we can work in the city with a lot of commitment. The Searching for Superpublics show how several projects that are at the intersection of, say after Bloomberg, I would say there's a lot of funding and a lot of support during Bloomberg, High Line, Hudson River Park, the Brooklyn Bridge Park, public space for public space's sake was a thing. After Sandy, it felt like public realm at a large scale was being delivered as a kind of layer of coastal resiliency efforts, like 6 miles of Rockaway Beach, is a seawall under a berm with a boardwalk and a lot of public spaces along it that connect with other spaces of the city. Only glancingly in the show is the East Side Coastal Resiliency and South Manhattan Coastal Resiliency included in the large model. There's also the Staten Island Bluebelts, which is a kind of inland thought that's been evolving for a long time. I guess of these projects, what would be your comment about them? Which are more successful? Which are less successful? What aspects of those things where the public realm's intersecting with thinking about water management at the edge of the city or inland as there are rain bombs and things like that you mentioned?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Staten Island Bluebelts. If I feel like it is just something that it's like, why don't we all get Bluebelts? I want a Queens Bluebelt, I want a Manhattan Bluebelt. I want a Brooklyn, like that. Just to me, it's also getting into the management of the city. And we're starting to get around that with the Bureau of Coastal Resilience, BCR, which is embedded now. Sorry, this is a little shop talk, but that's embedded in, in our in the DEP. But I think we somehow still have this bifurcation of like that there's coastal and then there's inland and upland. But one beautiful thing that the Bluebelts does is it goes from the highest, high points of Staten Island and it comes all the way out into the creeks and the water bodies. And I feel like we're really bad at that. And somehow the Bluebelts is a welcomed presence in Staten Island. It is understood as a park system. It's understood as highly necessary, that people understand that the Bluebelts are really helping, helping their neighborhood. And then I don't think we're very good at describing intact contiguous landscapes as infrastructure. Right now, it's sort of like, well, we're going to do this coastal thing over here, and then we're going to do this upland creek thing over here, and not really framing it out as this contiguous system. So I'm a Bluebelt fan.
Note, because we were considering, for example, the East Side Coastal Resiliency project, and we didn't actually have, in the end, enough room to include all the projects we wanted. That one had an interest. That one had East Side Coastal Resiliency had a challenge where it actually had to create a seawall,
Yes.
They did create a seawall, and then had to create a secondary system to address the water that got retained behind the seawall in a large rain event. And so it was this kind of layers of engineered infrastructure.
My joke, it's not a joke, it's a real thing, but the phase 1 of any wall project is a pump station. Right. So that's just, I'm a little nuts about all of this stuff. So talking about it just offhandedly, but obviously if you're building a wall, then phase one is always you have to pay for the pump station because that has to come first and has to come first before you build the wall. And then you also need, right, because when you have a rain bomb, all the water collects behind the wall and then then you cause upland flooding, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's just the other thing that you need is obviously incredible administrative and managerial system to activate these systems, right? So people who are cleaning the infrastructure, an understanding about who's responsible for closing the gates and when, and so it's actually a very, very administratively intensive process, and it's also and I understand why we did it. Like in that SIR plan, we also said, okay, Lower Manhattan, you're putting a wall. So everyone says, oh, it's a big U, but that project was actually in SIRR because of the intensity of building and the economics kind of sector that required insurance and all that sort of thing. But, is that an answer for the world? No, that's something where I think many downtown areas are going to be raising flood walls, paying for pumps, trying to figure out a bureaucracy that can open and close the gates. And then the rest of us will need other solutions.
Okay, maybe tangentially related, but moving to another Superpublic that's upstairs. You mentioned Robert Moses several times and showed the Robert Moses map across the entire city. I was privileged to be invited to be on a panel discussion this weekend up in the Bronx River Arts Center by Urban Omnibus and Elizabeth Hamby and others, as well as local activists who've been around for a whole lifetime there, were reflecting on the future of the Cross Bronx Expressway and the Reimagined Cross Bronx project. And that obviously has a history of, that we all know about dividing a city in half and also creating incredible, in addition to kind of slashing a social fabric in half, creating terrible health conditions. Mm-hmm. It was made more poignant to me because I hadn't really been on the Bronx River before, where it meets the Cross Bronx Expressway, which is more or less where the Bronx River Arts Center is. So there's kind of ecological dimensions in addition. But
Bronx River is so beautiful in some places.
Yeah. So the kind of desire to kind of cross stitch, and create a fabric of public realm and bridges and connections that are green and vital and replenishing for the neighborhood and other things that at least are knitting the social fabric together as part of a public realm exercise to restore the community is one of the conversations there. But how do you reflect on that project and the possible futures of the Cross Bronx Expressway?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned ESCR, the East Side Coastal Resilience Project, and having been in the room in the early days of that, and I think even some of the project's engineering and architectural designers might make the same comment, but I was always like, why are we leaving the highway intact and we're ripping down the park, right? Isn't the highway the site? Like if we're trying to reduce carbon emissions and, adapt. So, the only thing I would say is like, let's not just let the cars, let's think more holistically. I know it's probably impossible in practice to do that, but, the Jackie Robinson, I've showed those images and it's like how billions of cars are moving through this landscape. And we all know of other great cities in the world that are not so dependent on the private car and have not given over so much realm. So, the idea of reducing the width of, making kind of some, deckovers for housing and for other public uses, this seems to be like just absolutely something we should have done 20 years ago. But all I'm saying is don't just leave the highways as they are. We also have to do operations on those roadways. And I think that's where where we've fallen down a little bit is that we have this kind of failure of imagination as to how we're going to move ourselves around a little bit. And that's one of my, pet projects is the Jackie Robinson, right? I showed you how it's severing East New York from this amazing park resource. And it's just cut up into tiny little pieces, just like Flushing Meadows. And, there's not like a contiguous bike lane there's no way to walk. It's like the really like the basic things of making, a safer kind of roadway and making a mode for alternative transportation seems to just be like the most basic thing. So, let's try to think about that. And I guess that's where, I think there's a lot of room for New York to change and to, what I think is working very well are the greenways. I'm sure there's big greenway initiatives. We're working on the Harlem River Greenway. We're working on, this incredible Hudson Highland Fjord Trail up on the Hudson River. That's 7 miles of like a linear kind of armature that's kind of bringing people out to the Hudson River and making a contiguous walking and bikeway. It's like these are the projects of the future, right? We actually have to be more aggressive about undoing some of the mistakes. And so I think something that New York is doing right are these greenways, but I think we could be even more aggressive. When I first moved here, we were both here 20 years ago, and the idea of like a contiguous public realm on even a riverfront was like, oh no, and you had to like duck under an overpass and then like climb over a fence and then like, oh, there's the East River. But now, through a lot of planning and a lot of great work by many professionals, that is kind of a little bit closer. But it's just, the fact is that has been Manhattan-centric. Sorry. It has not been really, it has not come out to us in Queens and in a meaningful way and other boroughs. So, yeah.
I mean, hopefully the Queensway is at least a starting point.
Yeah, I'm super pro Queensway. We just lost our federal money for it. But yes, we will build. Yeah.
2 more quick questions, and then we'll get some audience participation. I think in your work, you've talked about social resiliency as well as environmental resiliency, and maybe that's becoming a more familiar term as well. Obviously, it's a critical dimension of creating public spaces. I think it's, in a way of thinking, super important right now in this era that we're living through. But I guess it just, if you could kind of elaborate a little bit about how that term interacts with the other kind of ideas that you brought tonight. How do you create good social resiliency and places that sort of foster it, if that makes sense?
I mean, I point towards the urban ecology book too, because in the book I interview people who've been important to me, like Pete Malinowski or Ido Sella, and one of the people is Eric Kleinenberg. So during this HUD Rebuild by Design, I'll never forget, it was like, oh God, we have to go to this lecture and it's a sociologist. And, I don't know. I was just like, all right, I'll just kind of suffer through that. But it was Eric Kleinenberg, and he's a sociologist at NYU. And so he was kind of talking about kind of the social life of climate change and how people's relationships to each other. He wrote a book called Heat Wave about the Chicago heat waves and how, I mean, many chapters into it, but how, people who knew their neighbors were less likely to perish in the heat wave. And that's because of the social resilience. That's because people were looking in on each other, checking in on each other, that actually relationships are saving our lives. And intact relationships are saving our lives. And so part of the way that Living Breakwaters evolved was from his kernel of that kind of nugget of idea that's embedded there, which is that, okay, so people are going to be safer on Staten Island, not only because of this physical project, but because they understand their risk 360 degrees in a more holistic way, and because they know each other. And so, that enhanced kind of level of trust, that sort of weaving that fabric of relationships it's not something that you can put in AutoCAD, understand. But it is something that if you're thinking about, a physical project and you're thinking about this notion of a public or a constituency or groups of people who are coming together to, essentially kind of manage that project, that's literally the essence of landscape. A landscape is not a wilderness. It's a physical piece of land that's been tended by people and that is cherished by people. So I'm really trying to get like back to that root of what is landscape. And to me, social resilience is sort of another way of just saying that in a way, because you're kind of working together, whether it in the, to, grow a crop or to, cultivate an oyster breakwater. It's kind of a related set of actions. So I think that social piece is something that is wildly different, wildly difficult to do, but it's more about sort of choreography and understanding existing ways that people are gathering and kind of weaving that into your approach.
Last question, and then audience time. You showed the OG images of yourself during Rising Currents, and the kind of the setup of Gowanus and then the kind of living breakwaters, or the proto version of that. I was here earlier this year when you guys did the kind of I don't know, it was 10 or 15 year anniversary of Rising Currents, and with Barry Bergdahl and all the other teams, and that was I think something that really got the design community very excited. And the ideas have really kind of propagated and carried forward in many cases. It was interesting to kind of close with my questions, a quite extended conversation by yourself and by the rest of the group about effecting policy change. And it was beyond kind of the normal purview of designers and design professionals, but it was sort of like about activism, advocacy, and changing the rules effectively of the way that the city plans and that designers design. I guess I was wondering if you'd be willing to just revisit a little bit, like where you felt we could, or people should come in that's actually an effective place of advocacy for the AIA and for our design community that makes a difference. There's somewhere between working in your neighborhood and going to Washington, like where do you jump in to like actually bring about change around urban ecology and sustainability and a healthier public realm as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a designer and you hear policy, it's like, oh God, hit the snooze button. Or like, I don't want to read that much or whatever. But I kind of phrase it like design to influence policy. Like we are still designing, but we have goals, and we want to create pilots where you can kick the tires and show how something is good for the world and can and how policy could be modified. So the Gowanus Lowlands is designed to influence policy that helped to push city planning in Brooklyn to kind of adopt certain stance toward that public realm. Living breakwaters is designed to influence policy. It is illegal to fill in the water bodies. So we had to, work with our regulators to get that project approved, and it is approved as a pilot so that other projects could learn from it and, modify it and move forward. And we have, we've locked ourselves into this understanding of the world, which is that we have to like protect nature and we can't modify it in the ways that I would like to modify it because, but the reality is that climate is changing and like these changes are happening faster than we can even keep up with. So we have to be able to trial, test, iterate, pilot. And so that's how I think designers can make a difference. And obviously, in architecture, in housing, there's so much we have to do. And so that's been a kind of a driving force for us, is that we're also trying to expand the policy space so that we can kind of, work in different ways and try to keep pushing to, evolve the regulations to meet the needs of what we see is coming in the future. So it's not like I'm writing policy and going to Washington, D.C., even though I would like to testify about the Army Corps of Engineers at some point. But at the moment, it's really about showing different ways of solving and addressing some key challenges and not letting it go there, pushing it step forwards and kind of making some of those suggestions. So, yeah.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Do we have a microphone? Do we have a microphone person? Ah. Okay.
Do we have a microphone to pass? Oh, here it comes. Oh, but we can hear you.
Okay,
Here, she's right up here.
I was going to say I found it really fascinating. I would love your okay, thank you. Are you able to hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, that I find that human-induced landscape design often prompts mechanisms of unseen scientific disruption, both above the soil line and below the water line, specifically what I have termed the vital unseen. So in park and landscape design, there's a vast underground mycorrhizal fungal network, which is pretty much overlooked by many landscape designers, which tends to prompt a chaos underground because they're planting all sorts of competing species, which causes a fairly vast disruption in the fungal network, which is what allows nutrient uptake and stress tolerance among plants. So it's really, really important. And in the aquatic parks and the revitalization of the waterfront, people routinely hack all of the barnacles off the hulls of ships, off of the docks, and they're seen totally as a nuisance species. But often the methods, and I really wanted to hear your thoughts, are way more toxic. And the barnacles actually are filter feeders, and they actually make a natural structure for the community. They're symbiotic with the whale population. I mean, they're actually really important. So I wonder what your thoughts are on some of these vital unseen species or the hyphae in the room.
Yeah.
So
no, I mean, I'm going to go back to my story about Forest Park in Queens, which was that big contiguous piece of land that I kind of blew past. But, this is a great example of what could have been really treated differently by New York. So I think Central Park is 840 acres. Forest Park used to be almost that big, but it's been like cut into tiny little pieces, and there's different, things that have just been plopped in it. So it's just been carved up. But it was basically a knob and kettle topography with this incredible oak oak landscape, right? Black oaks, all the fairly unusual oaks, and probably one of its biggest services as infrastructure is its intact soil and contiguous soil. So I mean, I definitely feel like the unseen, what I'm dealing with. Like if anyone, I'm sure many architects in the room, you have this characterization, which is like urban fill. That just means it's like people are just throwing garbage in there. Like Flushing Meadow Parks is basically urban fill. It's ash, it's garbage, it's, et cetera. But, I think valuing contiguous soil is absolutely key. And I would just tie that back to the depave agenda, right? Which is like, unfortunately, soil not connected to the air is dead. It's just not living matter. So if we were to think about soil as a sort of a living biome, right, that's breathing and supporting, then our agenda has to be to let it breathe, right? Let it become part of the ecosystem. So I would just say that we have to just advance a depaving agenda and advance a sort of a more kind of coherent idea about what's below and above the surface. I don't disagree with you. Yeah.
Somebody else?
Thanks for your work and yours, all your work. I remember when they renamed the Jackie Robinson Parkway.
Yeah.
I said, oh, Lord, that's going to make it harder to rip up. It should be the Jackie Robinson Greenway, iconic figure. My question, though, is when we were trying to save the Mariners Harbor wetland in Staten Island, and I had worked with Al Appleton years ago under Mayor Dinkins on the Staten Island Bluebelt, and he had worked with the predecessors. Well, props to Al, still working. I thought the example of the existing Bluebelt in Staten Island, and this is after all, we were doing this after Superstorm Sandy. So the structures, as you know, that were adjacent to the Bluebelt were the ones that had the best survival rates, even upland and inland after those storms, because the effects were all over the island. I thought that example would help us save that wetland, which was adjacent to an empty big box store that had already gone out of business. I think it was BJ's or something. But we couldn't do it. Part of it, I realized, is people weren't around in the early 90s who are living there now, right? They weren't born. I work with people who weren't born then. But do you have any thoughts about how we can use positive reference models like that? Yeah. You're using the Billion Oyster Project. Everybody loves that, who I talk to around the world. I take them to the dock. I'm sorry for the long question.
No, that's okay. No. I mean, it's what's funny is that sort of that was happening on Staten Island, but that's in the wake. It's the same process of what happened in Flushing Meadows, right? It's like, hey, look, a big flat area, let's pave it and put something on it, right? So yes, right, true, because it's taking up this precious space, et cetera. But, I do feel like we have to say we got to redraw the map, and we need new tools. So, paving over a wetland in Staten Island, which largely was a wetland, is probably not the best idea. You can densify in the higher ground. You can find other ways to increase FAR in other zones. But, does anyone know, has anyone seen the Ian McCarg plan for Staten Island? Have you seen that? Yeah. So someone from city planning called me 10 years ago, and I think they were cleaning out their files, and they found the original drawings of the Ian McCarg plan for Staten Island. So if you just look at that, that is sort of, he drew that before the Verrazano Narrows went in. We had the plan. We had an idea of where to build and where not to build. It's not a no-build plan. It's like, build here, don't build there. And then somehow it just became like a free-for-all. So, I think there are lots of ways to use positive examples. The big change with the change that I started to talk about, which is where we went from oyster texture, and then I called it what? Living breakwaters, is that I was describing it as infrastructure, right? I was quantifying its benefits, modeling its efficacy, proving it as infrastructure. So I hate to have to go there at this day and age, because who doesn't know that a wetland absorbs water and keeps it out of your basement and is a cushion? But nevertheless, I think that language is incredibly helpful. So pairing that infrastructural characterization with obviously all the other health, safety, ecosystem benefits is something that could help.
Maybe all the way in the back. People in the back get discriminated against because you can't see them from here.
Thanks. Claire Mifflin, Center for Zero Waste Design. I love your work, and I've been looking at talking about soil and garbage and engaging communities. I like to think what could happen with all the food scraps in New York City. Like the East River Resilience Park was trying to design out Lower East Side Ecology Center because they didn't want a waste facility, compost facility in the beautiful park. But it seems to me that if you had it as part of maintenance, as part of recreation, that you take your landscape waste and local community food scraps, you make it into compost there, and then you regenerate and apply it to the grass lawns every year. It can be part of both engaging the community and having the green spaces act as a sponge and having local stewardship. And we should be designing our parks in such a way. So I just wanted to get your view on that, because I know it's
I'm so with you. I mean, I feel like we have to have different eyeballs. We need different ideas about what is beauty and what is nature. And the food scraps are the nature, the future nature, right? So the idea of it's this pile of, compost is in the way of my park is ridiculous, right? Because it's just, for me, I see, we're talking earlier about I was talking about the Hudson River and, the Hudson River School of Painting, right? Where it's like, oh, we have this beautiful scene and it's picturesque and there's the foreground, the middle ground, the background, there's the person pointing at the sunset. And like, this is all fine. But then that was all supported by this carbon intensive development. You don't see the carbon dioxide in the air. It's all, I'm fake. It's fake. It's the idea of that is, that the Lower East Side ecology isn't appropriate for a park is just bananas at this time in this world, right? Because it's people working and participating and like understanding this integrative cycle that is part of a human ecology system is the future. So, trying to design that out of the frame is just egregiously wrong, in my opinion. So, we need different ideas of beauty. We need different ideas of what landscapes look like and who gets to work in them. And I think that, it's a missed opportunity, Yeah.
Hi. Interesting that you talked about your project as kind of prototypes in a way. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the process as one makes a prototype of finding what works, what doesn't work, and how you integrate that with your clients' expectations, mostly skill-wise and cost-wise, I guess.
Cost-wise, I'm going to skip that part, but I think what works, what doesn't work. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I just feel like it's like throwing things in the future, right? Like trying to figure out how to make connections between things that are disconnected. And that might have to do with like building on social systems that are already there, meeting like the oyster texture model that I showed was like a hand knit model. And I'm using this as a metaphor, but it's actually how I think, which is, we basically made a knitting spec and said, okay, here's the yarn, and then FedExed it to knitters. And then we brought it back and like wove the whole thing together. So I feel like that's the template for how to do things, now. It's about understanding how many, many different people can contribute, having like a vision for the future, but then understanding that is like it's part of the public realm and it's going to have many, many hands touching it. So, I think that's sort of indicative of how I think landscapes are successful. Yeah.
Anybody else? One more question. I guess we could wrap up a little bit early then. And Kate there's a bunch of Kate's books here tonight. I would encourage you to pick one up and get it signed by Kate. So thank you, Kate. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm truly inspired.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming.
We'll keep searching. Yeah, I'll be over here for 15 minutes or so if anyone has any more questions. Thanks.